In March 2014, what started as a search for a missing motorcycle taxi driver on the outskirts of Ibadan, Nigeria, quickly spiraled into a chilling discovery of a compound. What locals found inside was something out of a nightmare. The events that took place were so horrific that even today, the area is informally known as the Soka Evil Forest or the Soka Forest of Doom. To this day, nobody really knows who is responsible for the horrors in the Soka Forest, as authorities have refused to investigate. A word of warning that viewer discretion is strongly advised for this case, as some of the details are quite distressing. If you enjoy bizarre mysteries and other crime-related content, please be sure to subscribe to my channel. Now, let's lift the thin veil. The events that took place in Soka Forest were near Ibadan, the capital of Oyo State, which is one of Nigeria's largest and fastest growing cities. Located about 80 miles northeast of the country's capital, Lagos, it was once Nigeria's most populous city and served as the administrative center under British colonialism. One of the central figures and resident of Ibadan in this story was a young motorcycle taxi driver. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are colloquially known as Okadas, and you'll be hearing me using this word. This man's name was Kazim, but if you try to look this story up online, he was also known as Abakuta and some other names, but for simplicity, we'll refer to him as Kazim. On March the 21st, 2014, he set out for work on his motorcycle like any other day. Witnesses last saw him around midday that Friday, leaving Ibadan to drop off a friend. Shortly after, he got a call from another friend who sounded panicked, urging him to come quickly. The issue was that his location was slightly out of the city, and it's not clear where it exactly was, but it was later reported to be in a secluded area. In a city where crime is not uncommon, Okada riders knew better than to travel alone when leaving their usual routes. The dangers ranged from armed robbery to far more gruesome fates. Additionally, by the time Kazim would be returning, it was going to be pretty dark. Understanding the risks, Kazim asked his cousin to accompany him to meet this friend. The next day, Kazim was nowhere to be found. He didn't show up at the usual gathering spot where Okada riders waited for fares, something that raised a red flag within the group. In Nigeria, due to the dangerous nature of the job, Okadas form a tight-knit community, almost like informal unions, where riders look out for each other, so they knew it was up to them to ensure Kazim was safe. When they tried calling him, his phone rang, but he never picked up. That's when concern turned to suspicion. The Okadas did tell the police, but they were not expecting much from them. There had been cases of Okada drivers gone missing before, and the police barely did anything. The Okadas knew that they had to take it upon themselves to search for Kazim. With hours passing and still no word from Kazim, his fellow riders couldn't shake the fear that he and his cousin had suffered the same mysterious fate. Through the last friend Kazim was with before heading to pick up his final passenger, they pieced together that he was last seen heading towards the Soka Forest, which is within a large national reserve called the IITA Forest Reserve, right on the outer city limits. The region has long been associated with organized crime, and after dark, it becomes even more dangerous. Then, out of nowhere, one of the Okada drivers received a call. It was Kazim. He was in full panic mode, saying he'd been kidnapped along with 8 strangers and had been buried alive or trapped somewhere underground. The kidnappers had taken everything from them, but they had missed a second phone he had hidden, his only lifeline. He had no idea where he was or who had taken him, but he was sure they were deep in the Soka Forest. He managed to give them rough directions, a footpath leading into the forest, marked by a river and abandoned cars. He insisted that if they followed that path, they'd eventually hear him and the others shouting for help. Word of the situation spread amongst the fellow Okadas, and without hesitation, around 40 of them set off towards the forest, tracking the path Kazim described, with Kazim still on the line. I tried to look up the path in the Soka Forest, and this isn't the same path, but this is how narrow it was described to be. There are also African news channels that show some of the route there if you look it up on YouTube. Eventually, the Okadas found the path close to the abandoned cars and river, and then, just like that, the call dropped. They tried calling back, Nothing. Kazim wasn't picking up. Everyone who heard that call was left shaken, terrified, and utterly confused. Kazim's abduction didn't fit the typical ransom scenario. He wasn't wealthy, so if money wasn't the motive, then what was? With horrifying possibilities of kidnapping running through their minds, the Okada riders pressed forward, cautiously navigating the narrow forest path until they came upon what looked like an abandoned group of buildings. From these buildings, they could hear screams of people asking for food and water. But before they could get far, chaos erupted. Out of nowhere, a man burst from the bushes and opened fire. Panic set in, the riders scattered, some diving for cover, others bolting back towards their bikes. They had no choice but to retreat. Back in the city, they regrouped, shaken but not deterred. If anything, the attack only confirmed their worst fears. Something terrible was happening in that forest. Word spread fast and about 60 more Okada riders and other members of the community joined them, bringing their numbers to around 100 men. Armed with whatever they could get their hands on, guns, knives, machetes, they were ready to return to Soka Forest and confront whatever was waiting for them. The first time, they had moved quietly, hoping to slip through unnoticed. This time, they wanted to be seen and appear threatening. As they re-entered the forest, they made as much noise as possible, shouting, banging on trees, causing a commotion. This plan worked. Whoever tried to attack them earlier had backed off. As they got closer to the buildings, another call came in from Kazim. His voice was barely a whisper. He said he could hear footsteps above him. That was all the confirmation they needed. They were close. Without hesitation, the Okada riders stormed the building. But what they found inside was beyond horrifying. Several dozen people were chained to the walls, emaciated, hollow-eyed, their faces frozen in trauma, and some were still alive and begging for food and water. Bones littered the floor, some still clinging on to bits of flesh. For a moment, the Okada riders stood frozen, trying to process the atrocity in front of them, but they quickly snapped into action, breaking chains and freeing the captives. Some ran the moment they were released, while others were too weak, too broken to move, just staring blankly into nothing. The group pressed on, searching the surrounding buildings, and what they found next was even worse. Piles of human skulls, about 100 of them, rows of unmarked graves, trails of dried blood painting a grim picture of untold violence. In one shack, they found hundreds of personal belongings, clothes, shoes, bags. Among them were school uniforms and even baby clothes, a gut-wrenching sign that children and infants had likely met the same fate. Then, they discovered another building. Inside, the smell hit them first, and when they stepped in, they saw why. Corpses, about 50 of them, stacked, scattered, and in various stages of decay. Some were missing limbs, others had no heads at all. Outside the compound and the surrounding area were countless skeletal remains. Amidst the chaos, they started digging holes to find Kazim. He had been sending messages whenever he could, and at one point, he called again, whispering that he still heard footsteps above him. He was sure the Okada riders were close, but his phone battery was nearly dead. Then, silence. The call cut off abruptly. When they tried calling back, it went straight to voicemail. They couldn't pinpoint his exact location, but one thing was certain. He was underground. His friends kept digging, tearing up the earth in multiple spots, searching for any hidden chamber, basement, or underground prison. But no matter how deep they went, they found nothing. No tunnels, no hidden doors, no trace of Kazim. What started as a mission to rescue one man had led the Okada drivers straight into a nightmare. They expected to find a handful of recent kidnapping victims. Instead, they stumbled into a mass grave, a place where people had been chained, tortured, and left to die, their remains mingling with those who perished before them. By the time the police began arriving, the community knew exactly what to expect. In a system where justice often favored the powerful, cases like this, cases without money or influence behind them, rarely got the attention they deserved. Still, the sheer scale of the horrors unfolding in the Soka Forest left them no choice but to involve the authorities. Surely, this was too big to ignore. Surely, the police would have to act. But shockingly, their response was almost as indifferent as before. By the time authorities finally showed up, Some captives had already fled in panic. Others, too weak to move, remained behind, skeletal, frail, barely clinging to life. One collapsed right in front of the officers and never got back up. The exact number of survivors is uncertain, but reports suggest around 30 were found. Of those, 6 were hospitalized. As for the rest, no one knows what became of them. The number of lives lost totally is believed to be in the several hundreds. Some of the victims had been homeless or mentally ill, their disappearances easily overlooked, but others, like Kazim, had families and communities desperately searching for them. The discovery sent shockwaves throughout the entire country, but the outrage only deepened when the police made their next move. Shortly after the site was uncovered, forensic experts were ordered to investigate, but before they could even begin, authorities arrived, not to secure evidence, not to dig deeper into the truth, but to demolish the buildings. The governor of the state at the time, Abiola Ajimobi, personally told the police that the local residents had asked him to tear the site down. Whether or not this is true is unknown, but it seems counterintuitive as a lot of people there believed their family could be inside those buildings, or potentially underground. The demolition did go ahead, and whilst it was stopped after a little while, it's believed it was too late. By tearing down the structures, they destroyed crucial evidence that could have exposed the full scale of what happened in that forest. Even more disturbing, the demolition took place while Kazim and others were still unaccounted for and possibly trapped underground, blocking any exits. The Okadas and other members of the community begged the authorities to dig up the area, hoping to find survivors who might still be trapped underground, or at least some explanation about why their loved ones had vanished without a trace. But instead of prioritizing the search for answers, the government focused on erasing the scene. Police and military personnel were deployed to barricade the forest, blocking access to families desperate for closure. Many had loved ones who had gone missing and wanted to check if their belongings or remains were amongst the victims. But instead, the authorities shut the community out, instead of allowing them to search, claiming to preserve the site while bulldozing the evidence. Desperate to find their missing loved ones, people tried to force their way into the forest, sparking riots, and the authorities responded violently. 2 individuals were reportedly shot and killed during protests, and several others were injured. After the demolition and cleanup, the authorities simply walked away, leaving the forest to swallow its secrets, and once again, letting the local community handle the investigation themselves. The Okada riders and other members of the local community refused to give up. Every day for weeks, they came back, digging through the rubble by hand, determined to find Kazim and any other survivors. Items found at the site suggested it had been used for kidnappings for at least 10 years. The horrors didn't end there, however. A few days after the discovery of the site, they noticed a man lingering around the area, acting strangely. When they confronted him, they allegedly found items which could have belonged to the captives in his pockets, along with something even more terrifying: several human body parts. Convinced he was involved in the atrocities, they killed him on the spot. Unfortunately, the community taking the law into its own hands had its consequences. It didn't take much for someone to be accused of being connected to the Soka Forest site. Several other people who had no connection to the crimes, but were either just mentally ill and/or homeless around the compound, were accused and killed, either by being burned alive or through lynching. Although prominent politicians and authorities promised a thorough investigation, nothing ever happened, and to this day, what happened in the Soka Evil Forest remains buried in secrecy, and Kazim was never found. But the question remained, what was the site in the Soka Evil Forest being used for? Nigeria has a disturbingly high kidnapping rate, with thousands of people abducted each year, sometimes for political reasons, but more often for ransom. But there's a much darker side to this crisis. Some victims are taken for slavery, forced marriage, or even their body parts. At first glance, the most obvious explanation would be organ trafficking, humans being kidnapped and harvested for the black market trade. And while that's a real possibility, another theory stands out, one deeply rooted in Nigeria's cultural and spiritual landscape. Belief in witchcraft is widespread, and many seek out spiritual practitioners for rituals promising wealth or long life. These are known as money rituals. Some involve harmless offerings like hair clippings or herbs, but others demand something far more sinister, sometimes the body parts of animals, and in the worst cases, even human remains, blood, organs, teeth, even entire heads, each believed to hold mystical power. The more vital the organ, the stronger its supposed influence. In a research paper in the International Journal of Innovative Science and Research Technology, author Dr. Olayemo argued that the tradition of money ritual describes a situation where, quote, a person is killed and then their body parts are harvested and used for ritual purposes, end quote. These rituals are not limited to any specific demographic. The article goes on to say, quote, while the perpetrators are from all social classes, Nigerians believe that agents of money ritual sacrifice include some poor people who desperately want to be wealthy, some young and elderly people, some rich people who want to maintain their status in society, some elites intoxicated by power and wealth, and some politicians seeking positions and fame, end quote. And the thing about money rituals is that it seems to be a growing phenomenon. In February 2020, after a series of money rituals plagued the country, Nigeria's House of Representatives had to declare a state of emergency and, quote, initiate a campaign towards changing the situation in the country, end quote. At first glance, and considering how quickly the government worked to cover it up, and accusations from the local community that the captors were selling body parts outside the building at night, the most logical explanation at the Soka Forest body farm points to these types of ritualistic killings. While we don't have the full testimonies of all the survivors from the Soka Evil Forest, some details about their ordeals have emerged. One was that of 72-year-old Cecilia Obaka. When she was found at the scene, she was unable to speak, though it was clear she was mentally aware. Later, when she was recovering at a hospital, it was revealed that Cecilia had gone missing in 2008 and likely had been a captive since then. That's almost 6 years in captivity. But what made her case even more disturbing was the fact that she hadn't disappeared from Ibadan. She was taken from Oyo State, nearly 5 hours away. Most would assume that the victims in the Soka Forest were from nearby communities, but Cecilia's case suggested otherwise. If she was kidnapped in Edo and transported all the way to Ibadan, it raised terrifying questions. How many other missing people from faraway places had been trafficked to the Soka Forest, and how far did this body farm kidnapping network spread? According to her grandchildren, Cecilia hadn't been traveling when she vanished. She had simply gone to the market one morning in 2008 and never returned. This means that someone abducted her in broad daylight, likely forcing her into a vehicle alongside other unsuspecting passengers. The fact that she survived in captivity for 6 years suggests she was kept alive just long enough until the day her captors had a use for her. Fortunately for her, that day never came. Another survivor, Nephew, shared his own chilling experience. He was working his stall selling herbal medicine when a group of men posing as government officials accused him of violating environmental laws. Before he could protest, they threw him into a van. Nephew initially thought he was being taken to a police station until he arrived at the Soka Forest. He was shackled to a wall in a room filled with other captives, strangers whose fates were just as uncertain as his own. Then there was Titi, another survivor with a harrowing account. She was simply standing in front of her house when a group of men approached and told her she was needed somewhere. Before she could question them, she was taken, just like that. No struggle, no explanation. She never saw her home again. Odunola, who was 22 and a student at the University of Agriculture in Abakuta, went missing in 2009. She went to do a decoration job at a church in Ibadan and never returned till she was found in the Soka Forest body farm in 2014. And none of these victims were kidnapped for ransom. Their families were never contacted. No demands were ever made. So this wasn't about the money. It was about something far darker. Victims were likely handpicked, either trafficked into the operation or sold out by someone they knew in exchange for money. The survivors' accounts also point to a highly organized operation. The captors were clearly not the masterminds of the operation, but enforcers, interacting with the prisoners only to bring food or inflict punishment, and based on survivor accounts, they were catering to a number of different human body part markets. Some survivors claim they never actually saw their captors kill anyone, suggesting that some victims may have died from starvation, illness, or the violent beatings administered by their captors. The building filled with decomposing bodies supports this theory. Some of those corpses were still intact, left to decay rather than being mutilated. However, the human skulls and other body parts found scattered deeper in the forest suggest some victims suffered a different fate. They were deliberately killed, and someone was dismembering their bodies, possibly for rituals or to sell body parts on the black market. Whilst all sorts of theories behind these crimes have been proposed, the true orchestrators of this horror show are yet to be found. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of all is the location itself. Although the site itself was deep within the tree cover, the Soka Evil Forest was very close to a growing community. There were homes, a plastic bottle factory, and other businesses nearby. People lived and worked just beyond the tree line, but this likely made the compound even more unassuming. It's believed that the compound was rumored to be a mental institution and a place to sleep for the needy. This cover allowed the captors to operate in plain sight without raising suspicion. The distant cries, the unusual activity, even the sight of people being led into the buildings and forest might have been dismissed as part of a treatment facility for the mentally ill. But the idea that some local residents knew what was going on inside couldn't be ruled out. Additionally, within the context of ritual killings, it wouldn't be surprising if a lot of the victims did have physical or mental disabilities, as they are considered to be more valuable since they are believed to possess wild forces within them which manifest as extreme wealth when sacrificed. Also, body parts from individuals with varying genetic conditions are believed to hold greater power in money ritual sacrifices. Disturbingly, many people who assist with the trafficking are believed to be related to their victims, as they also get compensated. A 2019 study in the UKH Journal of Social Sciences found that family members, friends, neighbors, and even religious leaders have been involved in these crimes, making it less likely that the victim would be reported missing. And even if they were, authorities were unlikely to take it seriously. The study also cited a survey revealing that 54% of respondents believe that Nigeria's obsession with material wealth, combined with extreme poverty, which affects almost half the population, is a driving force behind money ritual killings. Typically, a person who wants to do a money ritual would first get into contact with what's called a herbalist. The herbalist would request an offering, sometimes a human part, depending on how blessed the person wants to be. The parts could be sourced from well-connected herbal traders or human traffickers, or through the victim's own friends or relatives. A 2017 investigation by the Nigerian magazine Vanguard uncovered a horrifying truth. Human body parts were shockingly easy to obtain, with a thriving black market catering to buyers. The price list was as gruesome as it was matter of fact. A fresh human head could be bought for as little as 60,000 naira, which converts to roughly $350 today if adjusted for inflation. Other items were also easily available: skulls, legs, fingers, and other organs. Even small bones were not spared, starting at $15. If the Okada riders hadn't tried to find Kazim, the survivors they rescued from the Soka Forest would likely have been sold off in this way. Many believe the police and authorities knew about the horrors in Soka Forest long before the Okadas uncovered them. Whether they simply turned a blind eye or were paid to stay quiet, no one can say for sure. But their response afterwards, demolishing the buildings and walking away as if nothing ever happened, raises serious questions, like how many of these places are there, and how many have been covered up. Nigerian news reports claim that there is a correlation of missing people around election time, implying politicians use these people for money rituals, but that is not something I could find data on. If they had truly been shocked by the discovery, wouldn't they have launched a full-scale investigation? Their actions, or lack thereof, make it hard to chalk this up to mere incompetence. There is likely much more to this story, which we might never find out, unfortunately. Since the events of the Soka Evil Forest, the site has now been turned into a school. If you enjoy my videos, please consider subscribing. Thank you for listening, as always.